Good morning. This lecture video is going to go over the structures of the respiratory system. So you can kind of label the different parts as we go through them, and then we will look at what the function of each of those is. Your respiratory system is divided into the upper respiratory system, which is going to be your nasal cavity and your pharynx, larynx, and then your lower respiratory system, which will include your lung, and the bronchial tree and alveoli. So if we kind of follow the path that air is going to take through these different structures as we move through labeling. So if we start here with your external nares, so the external nares, is going to be your nostrils basically, or the area, this is going to be the place where air is actually going to enter into our body. Our nostrils are going to be filled with mucous membrane and nose hairs that are going to trap debris that might be floating around in the air, so bacteria, viruses, fungus, dust, that kind of thing. And that's what actually a booger is. It's just going to be dried up mucus and debris that your nose filtered out, because we don't want those things to enter into our lungs. Our lungs are our prime place for bacteria, viruses, fungus to grow. They're very damp, they're very dark, it's very warm. Microorganisms love those kinds of environments. So we want to try and filter out all of those bad things as much as we can. And so that's your nasal nares, your external nares is going to be bring that air into that nasal cavity. The next structure is the nasal septum. This is showing you a lateral or cut view of that. You know your nasal septum. It's the piece that divides your nasal cavity into left and right halves. The function of your nasal septum is it's going to actually direct the air to the back of the nasal cavity so that the air kind of doesn't get lost within that nose. Right behind that nasal or external nares is going to be three bony shelves, which are called the nasal conchae. Their job is to rapidly warm and humidify the air, because warmer air holds more oxygen, and we want it to be warm and moist air as we move it through our respiratory passages. In the back here is going to be, it disappeared, your nasal choanae, which you'll just want to draw a line like right here, because that's going to be where it is. It's basically the division between your nasal cavity and your oral cavity. Then down below, you're going to have this, we're going to come back to that. So down here is going to be your eustachian tube opening. So that's going to be the opening into your ear canal. Doesn't really play a role in respiration, but it is a nice landmark so that you can kind of see where things are compared to that opening into your ear canal. The very posterior part of the nasal cavity is going to be your palates. So you have a hard palate here, and you have a soft palate, and the soft palate will eventually fall down into that structure in the back of your throat called your uvula. Now, in these back areas, there are three sets of tonsils. So here's the pharyngeal tonsil, which are also known as your adenoids, your palatine tonsil, and then the lingual tonsils. And all of those are going to function in fighting infection. Back in here, all of this back here is considered what we would call your throat, but in biology we call it the pharynx. And it's not labeled. You probably should label it. But we divide the pharynx into three different areas. So back here, behind the nasal cavity, is the nasopharynx. Right here then, right behind the oral cavity would be the oropharynx, and right behind here, behind the larynx, would be the laryngopharynx. And so your pharynx is going to be your throat. You can see that your nasal cavity is all connected with your oral cavity, and you know this because you've had either food or beverages go in your mouth and end up coming out your nose. And you've also been able to, if you have a really bad cold, and you can feel the mucus that's draining from your nose down your throat. So you know that these are all kind of connected together. Down here is your larynx, which is kind of going to be, which is otherwise known as your voice box, but it does play some role in respiration. And then down here, which isn't labeled, but you might want to just add it on there, is going to be your trachea. So this is going to be your windpipe. So if we look at the different functions of these different parts, you can see, again, your external nares is going to be the entryway for air into the nasal cavity. Your nasal septum is going to divide that passageway into left and right halves so that it allows direct passageway for air. Your nasal conchae are the three shelves of bones that quickly humidify and warm the air. Your choanae are going to connect your nasal and oral cavity, that kind of region in between. Your hard palate, so again, stick your tongue up at the top of the roof of your mouth. That's your hard palate. It's the very bottom border or inferior border of the nasal cavity, and it plays a role in swallowing and speaking. And then the soft palate, if you push your tongue back far enough, you can feel when that hard palate starts to become more fleshy. That's the soft palate. It's going to prevent food from entering the nasal cavity, and it plays a role in swallowing, speaking, and breathing. And then your uvula is going to play a role in preventing food and liquids from entering your nasal cavity as well. So this is kind of like a flap that will shut off your nasal cavity so that food and beverages go down your pharynx instead of up your nasal cavity. That eustachian tube is the opening into the ear. The pharyngeal, palatine, and lingual tonsils all play a role in fighting infections because they're going to filter out the pathogens. And then you have your pharynx, which is our throat. And this is going to serve as a passageway for air and food, divided into the three different regions, like we mentioned, the nasopharynx, the ornopharynx, and the laryngopharynx. Looking specifically at your larynx now, so we've put the air has now gone through your nasal cavity down into your oropharynx and into your laryngopharynx, and now we're into the larynx. These are the structures that make up the larynx. This is the epiglottis right here, which is going to be a flap. This is your hyoid bone. And then this big shield piece is called the thyroid cartilage. You can kind of feel that. This bump right here is what will be what's called your Adam's apple. And then down here is this kind of smiley face piece of cartilage called the cricoid cartilage. And then in between here are these folds called vocal folds, otherwise known as your vocal cords. So again, if you look at the different structures here, your hyoid bone is going to play a role in helping you swallow and in speech, and it also serves as an attachment for muscles. Your thyroid cartilage is going to protect those vocal cords. The cricoid cartilage is going to be really important because it's going to keep the airway open. We don't want the airway to collapse because then we can't get air through. And then your epiglottis is going to actually play a role in, it kind of functions in the same way that your uvula does, except that it's going to cover the trachea or close off the trachea so that food does not go down the windpipe. So when we talk about food going down the wrong pipe, we're talking about food that ends up going down your trachea instead of your esophagus. So this epiglottis is going to function to kind of direct food to the esophagus and out of the windpipe. And then in here are the true vocal folds. These are going to protect your airways from choking. They regulate the amount of air that's flowing into the lungs, and then they produce sound. Sound is produced as air moves through these vocal folds or these vocal cords. So looking at the lungs, you have two lungs in your body, a left and a right lung. And this is going to be arranged opposite of the heart. So the apex is going to be the top part here of the heart. The base is going to be at the bottom. And then inside this indentation is called the hilum. You have two lungs, right and left. They are not the same size. Your right lung each lung is divided into lobes, and each lobe is divided into bronchopulmonary segments. So the right lung is going to be divided into 3 lobes, and then each one of those lobes will be further divided into those bronchopulmonary segments. And then your left lung is going to have 2 lobes. So if you look down here, and again, something we've talked about way back at the beginning of this course, we have lungs that are going to be surrounded by a serous membrane system. So the serous membrane system that surrounds the lungs are called pleural. So when we talked about the heart, we talked about those membranes that surrounded the heart, which were the pericardium. And when we get to digestive, those that cover the digestive organs are the peritoneum. But the pleura is the membranes that cover the lungs. There's the outside layer, which is the parietal pleural. This is a pleural cavity in between that and then the visceral layer, which is the inside layer of the visceral pleura. And in that pleural cavity, it's going to be the serous fluid, which functions to help reduce friction, and it holds that serous fluid. Again, apex is the top, hilum is the medial indentation, and the base is the bottom. The hilum is going to be that spot that's going to allow the heart to kind of sit in there in the lungs. And then again, your lung is divided into lobes, but then each lobe is further divided into bronchiopulmonary segments. You would want to draw underneath here a big, looks like a frowny face, a frown right here. That would be your diaphragm, and that's going to be a muscle that sits right underneath your lungs. It's really important because it's going to change the volume of the thoracic cavity, which will allow us to bring air in and out. All right, moving down to the lower respiratory system and the bronchial tree. So again, here's your larynx, here's your trachea. Your trachea is going to fork into each lung, a tube that will go into the left lung, a tube that will go into the right lung, and this point or this fork is called the carina. The primary bronchus is going to be the tube that goes into each lung. It will further branch into smaller tubes called the secondary bronchus, which are going to feed each of the lobes of the lung. And then each of those will branch into smaller ones called tertiary bronchus, which will feed each of the bronchiopulmonary segments. And at the very end of those are the smallest of the airways, which are the bronchioles. The bronchioles, so here's the bronchiole right here, it will eventually lead to a small duct called the alveolar duct, which will bring the air into these grape-like structures, which are called the alveolus. The alveolus is going to be where gas exchange takes place. So oxygen will leave the alveolus and go into the blood supply, into the capillaries. There's capillaries all over these alveoli. And carbon dioxide will go from the capillaries into the alveolus, in which case then it's going to move backwards through all of these structures until we breathe it out into the environment. So really important to know that the ultimate function of the respiratory system is to, one, bring oxygen into our lungs, which we can then at the alveoli bring into our blood supply. And number two, get rid of carbon dioxide, which is a waste product, get it out of our lungs, get it out of our blood, bringing it to the lungs, which will expire out, going through those same passageways that brought the air in. So inspiration is bringing that air in, and then expiration is bringing that air out. So again, here is just a brief description of the different structures that are involved in the bronchial tree. And then these are going to be what those structures serve, the regions that they serve. So like I said, the primary bronchus, there'll be one that goes into each lung. The secondary will go into each of the different lobes. And the tertiary will be into those bronchiopulmonary segments. If we were to look at a trachea and a lung under a microscope, this is what we would see, something of this sort. Couple terms or things that we have seen before when we did the tissue identification. So we kind of point them out here and you can see them as a part of a structure or the trachea. So here's the hyaline cartilage. Your trachea is full of C-shaped cartilages that go all the way down it. You can kind of see those right up here, those C-shaped pieces, hard pieces of cartilage. And those are really, really important because they keep our trachea open so that air can flow through them. So here's that hyaline cartilage. When we looked at this under the microscope, it looked like black-eyed peas. And the top part of the trachea is going to be pseudostratified columnar epithelial tissue. So you can see again these long column of cells. They have hairs on the outside of them called cilia, and embedded amongst these cells are specialized cells called goblet cells. So goblet cells are responsible for producing a mucus membrane layer. We want to have some mucus because it helps lubricate the passageways and it allows the air to travel through those passageways a little bit easier. However, we don't want too much mucus, and we want that mucus to be moved around so that it's not building up, and that's the job of the cilia. So those little hairs will kind of beat back and forth and move that mucus around so it doesn't get backed up into our airways. So that's the function of these things. When that cilia moves the hair, it's going to move that mucus around so that it either ends up getting swallowed or it ends up getting expelled, like you end up coughing it out or, hawking a loogie, for lack of a better term. So that would be kind of the histology of the trachea. If you look at the histology then of a lung, or at the bottom part of the lung, again, you can kind of see here is the bronchiole, okay, that smallest tube or air passageway, and all of these around here are going to be the alveoli. So right here you can really see it good. Those like grape-like rounded structures, that would be an alveolar sac, and this right here would be the alveolar duct. So these are going to be the things or the passageways that will feed those alveoli. And again, the bronchioles are the smallest tubes. Those alveolar ducts are going to be what's going to feed the air into the alveoli or the alveolus, and those are going to be where gas exchange takes place. So all of these would be surrounded by capillaries where oxygen can leave the alveoli and go into the blood, and carbon dioxide can leave the blood and go back into the alveoli. So those are the structures that are involved in your respiratory system.